Plates clinked against each other as conversation died around the dinner table. My grandmother stood at the head, her wine glass catching the chandelier light. Everyone froze mid-bite as she spoke, her voice cutting through the warm air like ice. "Let's stop pretending," she said coldly, looking directly at me. "She's not one of us. She's adopted." The fork slipped from my fingers, clattering against my plate. My aunt laughed softly, the sound like breaking glass. My adoptive mother's face drained of all color, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Grandma," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't even blink. "Blood makes family, not paper," she continued, taking a sip of wine as if she just commented on the weather. The room spun around me. My cousins exchanged glances, smirking behind their napkins. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. My throat closed up as I stumbled toward the bathroom, tears already burning my eyes. Behind me, I heard my cousins laughing through the walls, their voices muffled but unmistakable. I locked the bathroom door and slid down to the cold tile floor, wrapping my arms around my knees. My name is Marina. I'm 29 years old now, but that dinner happened when I was 19, right before I left for medical school. I was adopted as a baby after my biological parents died in a car accident. I never knew them, never remembered their faces or voices. My adoptive parents told me I was chosen, that they picked me specifically because they wanted me. For years, I believed that word meant something special. Chosen, like I was worth selecting, worth loving. My adoptive mother treated me like her own from day one. She stayed up with me during nightmares, helped me with homework, taught me to ride a bike. But my grandmother, Alina, never accepted me. From the moment I could understand language, she made sure I knew I was different. She'd introduce me to her friends with a tight smile. "This is Marina, our addition to the family." The pause before addition always felt deliberate, like she was choosing a word that wouldn't quite be a lie. "Chosen," they said, until the day they decided I wasn't. That's when I learned words only matter when the person saying them means it. I remember my 10th birthday clearly, even now. Pink balloons filled our living room, and a chocolate cake sat in the center of the table with 10 candles flickering. My cousins ran around playing tag while adults chatted in corners. Then my grandmother arrived late, carrying a wrapped box with a silver bow. Everyone gathered around as I opened it, expecting a doll or books. Instead, I found a DNA ancestry kit. The room went silent. My grandmother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe it'll tell us where you really come from," she said, her voice light but sharp. My adoptive mother's face turned red. "Mother, that's completely inappropriate." But my grandmother just shrugged, pouring herself coffee. "What? It's educational. The girl should know her roots." The adults laughed awkwardly, trying to smooth over the tension. I clutched the box, not understanding why it felt like an insult. That night, I heard my adoptive mother yelling at my grandmother through my bedroom door. "She's my daughter. You will not make her feel less than." My grandmother's response was too quiet to hear, but the damage was already done. Growing up, the wounds came in small, quiet ways. Family photos always seemed to happen when I was in the bathroom or getting a drink. "Oh, we already took it, sorry," my aunt would say with a sympathetic smile that never quite looked real. Cousin-only trips to the beach or amusement parks somehow never included me. "It's just for the blood relatives," my cousin once explained casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. At family reunions, distant relatives would study my face, comparing features. "She doesn't really look like either parent, does she?" They'd whisper, not quite quietly enough. My grandmother never corrected them. Instead, she'd nod knowingly as if they'd figured out some obvious secret. One summer afternoon, I was playing in the yard when I heard her talking to a neighbor over the fence. "We did charity once," she said, her voice carrying on the breeze. "We adopted." The word charity stuck in my chest like a thorn. I wasn't a daughter. I was a good deed. A checkbox on someone's list of noble actions. That night, I started keeping a journal, writing down every small rejection, every reminder that I didn't belong. I told myself I was documenting, but really I was just trying to make sense of the pain. By high school, I'd built a wall around myself. If I couldn't be loved, I decided, then I'd be respected. I studied late into the night, long after everyone else had gone to bed. My grades climbed to the top of my class. I joined every academic club, won science fairs, collected awards that lined my bedroom shelf. My adoptive mother was proud, hugging me after each achievement. But my grandmother would just glance at my report cards and say, Well, at least you're useful. When I got accepted into medical school with a full scholarship, I thought maybe, finally, I'd proven myself worthy. I showed my grandmother the acceptance letter, hands shaking with hope. She read it slowly, then handed it back. Doctors are supposed to have steady hands, she said flatly, not shaky origins. The words hit me like a slap. My adoptive mother tried to intervene, but I'd already turned away. That night, I made a decision. I would leave this town, this family, these constant reminders that I wasn't enough. I would become someone so successful that their rejection wouldn't matter anymore. I was wrong about that last part. At 19, I packed my entire life into 2 suitcases. My adoptive mother helped me load them into the car, tears streaming down her face. She hugged me tightly at the airport, whispering into my hair, "Don't let her make you hard, Marina. Keep your heart soft." I promised I would try, though my heart already felt like stone. My grandmother didn't come to say goodbye. She sent a card with $20 inside and a note that said, "Good luck with your studies." No love, no signature beyond her name. The flight to medical school felt like escaping prison. I watched my hometown shrink beneath the clouds and felt lighter than I had in years. For the first few months, my adoptive mother called weekly, updating me on family news. But slowly, the calls became less frequent. My grandmother never called at all. By my 2nd year, I'd stopped going home for holidays. It was easier to stay away, to build a new life with people who chose me not out of obligation, but genuine friendship. I didn't hear from my family again for years, and I convinced myself I was better off. 10 years passed like water through my fingers. I became a transplant surgeon, respected in my field. Known for my steady hands and calm demeanor in the operating room, I'd built a life in the city, far from the small town that never felt like home. Then one night my phone rang at 2 a.m. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was the hospital. But the number looked vaguely familiar. "Marina," a trembling voice said when I picked up. It was my aunt, the one who used to laugh softly at my grandmother's cruel comments. "It's your grandmother," she continued, her words tumbling out fast. "Her kidneys are failing. She's been on dialysis for months, but it's not enough anymore. The doctors say she needs a transplant soon or—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the obvious unsaid. I sat up in bed, my mind racing to catch up with this information. My grandmother was dying. The woman who'd spent my entire childhood making me feel worthless now needed saving. "Why are you calling me?" I asked quietly, my voice steady despite my pounding heart. The silence on the other end stretched long and uncomfortable. Finally, my aunt spoke again. "Because you're the only match." My aunt explained that the whole family had been tested as potential donors. Cousins, aunts, uncles, even distant relatives had volunteered, but none of them were compatible. The hospital ran my grandmother's blood type and tissue markers through the National Donor Database as a last resort. My name came up, the only compatible donor. "The doctors said it's actually common with adopted children," my aunt said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "Sometimes the genetic match works out in unexpected ways." She kept talking, explaining medical details I already understood better than she did. But all I could think about was the irony. Blood makes family, my grandmother had said, not paper. And now the only blood that could save her belonged to the girl she'd rejected. "So now I'm family?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. My aunt went silent again. Then quietly she said, "Please, Marina, she's dying." I hung up without answering. I sat in my dark apartment, staring at the phone for a long time. Outside, the city lights flickered like distant stars. Julian, my colleague and closest friend, had once asked me what I'd do if my family needed me. I'd laughed and said they wouldn't dare ask, but here we were. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through old photos on my laptop. Pictures from family dinners where I sat at the end of the table, slightly apart from everyone else. Birthday parties where my smile looked forced and small. Graduations where my grandmother stood at the back, arms crossed, while everyone else celebrated. Julian found me there in the morning, still in my pajamas, staring at the screen. He set down coffee and sat across from me without speaking. Finally, I looked up. "My grandmother is dying," I said. "She needs a kidney transplant. I'm the only match." Julian waited, knowing I needed to talk this through. "She spent my entire childhood telling me I wasn't real family," I continued, my voice shaking now. "She made me feel like I was nothing, and now she needs my blood to survive." Julian reached across the table, taking my hand. "Will you do it?" he asked simply. I thought about that question for a long time. Thought about revenge, about justice, about all the ways I could make her feel as powerless as she'd made me feel. I don't owe her my blood, I said finally, but I owe myself peace. 3 days later, I walked into the hospital where my grandmother was receiving treatment. My aunt had given me the room number reluctantly, like she expected me to change my mind. The waiting room was full of family members I hadn't seen in a decade. They all turned when I entered, their faces showing shock, confusion, and something that might have been shame. My aunt stood up quickly. "She actually came," she muttered to my uncle, loud enough for me to hear. My cousins stared at me like I was a ghost. I'd changed since they last saw me, grown into myself, become someone they couldn't dismiss as easily. I walked past them without speaking, heading toward my grandmother's room. A nurse intercepted me at the door. "Are you family?" she asked. The question almost made me laugh. "I'm the donor," I replied. Inside the room, my grandmother lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller and frailer than I remembered. Her skin had a gray tinge, and tubes ran from her arms to various machines. When she saw me, her eyes widened. Then she turned her head away. "She's not cutting me open," I heard her whisper to the nurse. Her voice was weak but still carried that familiar edge of rejection. The family doctor came in minutes later, a tired-looking man with kind eyes. He explained the situation clearly, using medical terms I already knew but appreciated hearing officially. "Marina is the only viable donor we've found," he said, looking between my grandmother and me. "Without this transplant, Alina, your prognosis is very poor." My grandmother stared at the ceiling, her jaw set stubbornly. "I'd rather die than take from her," she said, each word deliberate and cutting. The room went absolutely silent. My aunt gasped. One of my cousins started to protest, but my grandmother raised a shaking hand to stop them. Everyone looked at me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to beg, to plead, to prove how much I wanted to be accepted into this family. Instead, I simply nodded. "Then die angry, Grandma," I said calmly. "I'm not begging you to live." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving chaos behind me. I heard my aunt calling after me, my mother's voice rising in argument with my grandmother. But I kept walking down the hallway, into the elevator, out into the bright afternoon sunlight. I'd offered. She'd refused. That was her choice to make. I drove back to the city feeling strangely light, like a weight had been lifted. 4 days later, my phone rang again. This time it was the hospital directly. "Ms. Marina," a nurse said urgently. "Your grandmother collapsed this morning. She's slipping fast. The doctors don't think she has much time left without immediate intervention." I stood in my apartment, still in my scrubs from my own shift at the hospital. I just finished a 12-hour surgery and exhaustion pulled at my bones. "I see," I said carefully. "Her family has been trying to reach you," the nurse continued. "They're asking if you'll reconsider." I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. Dark circles under my eyes, hair pulled back severely, the professional mask I wore every day at work. Behind that mask was a little girl who'd once believed chosen meant something. "I'll think about it," I told the nurse and hung up. I stood there for a long time, coat in hand, keys on the table. Julian's words echoed in my mind. Peace. I owed myself peace. Finally, I grabbed my coat and headed back out the door. Not as family, but as the surgeon on call. Because that's who I was now. Someone who saved lives, regardless of whether they deserved it. I walked into the operating room at 6 a.m. the next morning. The surgery was scheduled for 7, giving me time to prepare, to center myself before the most complicated operation of my career. My grandmother was already prepped, unconscious on the table. The anesthesiologist nodded to me as I scrubbed in. Nurses moved efficiently around the room, checking equipment and monitors. The head nurse, an older woman named Patricia, approached me quietly. "You sure about this?" she asked, her eyes searching my face. She knew the situation. Hospital gossip traveled fast. I looked at my grandmother's face, peaceful in unconsciousness. For the first time in my life, she couldn't reject me, couldn't hurt me with her words. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Let's save her." I pulled on my surgical gloves, feeling the familiar snap of latex against my wrists. The surgical lights blazed bright, illuminating every detail. Heart monitors beeped steadily. The room smelled of antiseptic and determination. This was my world. The place where my hands were steady, where my origins didn't matter, where I was judged only by my skill and compassion. I picked up the scalpel and made the first incision. The surgery unfolded in careful, precise movements. Each cut measured, each stitch exact. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, a metronome keeping time with my work. Surgical lights glared bright overhead, creating stark shadows. As my hands moved with practiced skill, memories flashed through my mind unbidden. The 10th birthday party. The DNA kit. My grandmother's voice saying, "Maybe it'll tell us where you really come from." Beep, beep, beep. The cousin-only trips I was never invited to. Family photos I was never quite included in. The whispered conversations about charity cases. Beep, beep, beep. "Suction," I said calmly, and a nurse responded immediately. My hands remained steady despite the chaos in my head. Years of training had taught me to separate emotion from action. "You're doing great, doctor," Patricia said quietly. More memories. My grandmother refusing to attend my medical school graduation. The card with $20 and no love. The decade of silence. Beep. Beep, beep. Then I heard my own voice in my head, clear and strong. "You're better than this," it whispered. "You're better than her cruelty." My hands moved faster now, confident and sure. Connecting vessels, closing incisions, saving a life. "Surgery successful," I announced hours later, stepping back from the table. The room exhaled collectively. I walked out of the operating room exhausted, pulling off my surgical mask and cap. My scrubs were stained with blood, my hands aching from hours of precise work. The waiting room erupted when they saw me. My aunt rushed forward, my cousins close behind. My adoptive mother stood at the back, tears streaming down her face. "How is she?" my aunt asked breathlessly. I removed my surgical gloves slowly, methodically, taking my time to choose words. Everyone watched, holding their breath. "She'll live," I said finally, my voice flat with exhaustion. The relief in the room was palpable. My aunt collapsed into a chair, sobbing. My cousins hugged each other. Strangers in the waiting room smiled at the good news. Only my adoptive mother stayed focused on me, reading the emptiness in my eyes. I walked past them all toward the staff locker room, needing to shower, to change, to wash away the physical evidence of what I'd just done. But halfway down the hallway, a nurse caught up to me. "Dr. Marina," she said gently, "your grandmother is waking up. She's asking for you." I stopped walking, closing my eyes briefly. Of course she was. I turned around and headed toward the recovery room, still in my stained scrubs, still carrying the weight of a childhood's worth of rejection. My grandmother's room was dimmed, machines beeping softly in the background. She looked incredibly fragile against the white sheets, tubes and wires connecting her to various monitors. Her eyes were open when I entered, focused on the ceiling. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "Why did you do it?" I stood at the foot of her bed, keeping distance between us. For a long moment, I didn't answer, just looked at this woman who'd shaped so much of my pain. "Because I don't need to be your blood to have a heart," I said finally. My voice was calm, measured, empty of the anger I'd carried for years. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in my life, I saw her cry, real tears that spilled down her wrinkled cheeks and onto the hospital pillow. I waited for the apology, for the admission that she'd been wrong, for some acknowledgement of the years of cruelty. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But even as she said it, she turned her face away, unable to look at me directly. Even now, even after everything, she couldn't fully let go of her pride. I nodded once, accepting the inadequate apology for what it was. Then I left the room without another word, closing the door softly behind me. I took 3 weeks off work to recover from the donation surgery. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty, so I spent most days reading on my balcony and trying not to think about my grandmother healing with my kidney inside her body. Then my phone started buzzing with messages from family members I barely knew. At first, I ignored them, but the messages kept coming, each one stranger than the last. Finally, I opened one from a second cousin. "Can't believe you're using Grandma's illness for attention," it read. "Playing the hero just to make us look bad." I stared at the screen, confused. More messages followed, all variations of the same accusation. Apparently, rumors were spreading through the family. I hadn't donated to save my grandmother. I'd done it to make them all feel guilty, to paint myself as a saint while making them look like villains. "You just wanted to play hero," another cousin texted me directly. "Making sure everyone knows how selfless you are." I didn't respond to any of them, but later that week, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Hi, this is Marcus from the City Tribune," a cheerful voice said. I'm doing a story on medical miracles and family reconciliation. Would you be willing to talk about your grandmother's transplant? I initially refused the interview, but Marcus was persistent, calling back twice more. I've already spoken with your aunt, he said on the third call. She told me the whole story, how your grandmother rejected you your whole life and you still saved her. That's powerful stuff. Something in his voice made me pause. Maybe it was time people knew the truth, not the version my family would tell, but the real story. I agreed to meet him at a quiet coffee shop downtown. Marcus was younger than I expected, maybe 30. With kind eyes and a notepad already full of scribbled notes, I told him everything. The adoption, the rejection, the years of being treated as less than. The DNA kit at my 10th birthday, the decade of silence, and finally, the call asking for my kidney. The article came out 3 days later with the headline, "Adopted Daughter Saves Estranged Grandmother Who Rejected Her." It was fair, balanced, focusing on the medical miracle and the complicated dynamics of family. But the internet had other ideas. The article went viral within hours. Thousands of shares, hundreds of comments, people calling me a saint, a hero, the better person. My phone exploded with friend requests and messages from strangers. The public reaction was overwhelming and unanimous. I'd done something extraordinary, and my grandmother was publicly shamed. Within a week, my grandmother's entire social circle knew the story. The article had been shared in every local group, discussed in her church, whispered about at the grocery store. The family split down the middle. Half of them turned against my grandmother, finally seeing the cruelty they'd ignored for years. Phone calls were made, accusations thrown, old wounds reopened. The other half turned on me, angry that I'd made the family look bad to outsiders. My uncle called me furious. "You made her look like a monster," he shouted through the phone. "You humiliated her publicly. What kind of person does that?" I held the phone away from my ear, his voice sharp enough to hurt. "You made her look bad," he continued. "This was private family business." When he finally stopped to take a breath, I spoke quietly. "She did that herself," I said simply. "I just told the truth." He hung up on me, but others called too. Distant relatives I hadn't thought about in years, suddenly interested in my side of the story. Some apologized for their silence, for not standing up to my grandmother when I was young. Those calls were almost harder to take than the angry ones. Then, unexpectedly, my adoptive mother showed up at my apartment. I opened the door to find her standing there with red eyes and trembling hands. My adoptive mother came inside without being invited, sitting heavily on my couch. She'd aged since I last saw her, gray streaking through her hair, lines deepening around her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, tears already falling. "I should have protected you better. I should have stood up to her more firmly." I sat across from her, watching this woman who'd raised me with as much love as she could manage. "I thought keeping peace was protecting you," she continued, her voice breaking. "Thought if I could just smooth things over, make excuses for her behavior, that eventually she'd come around, that eventually she'd see how special you were." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "But I was wrong. I failed you." I moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. "You did your best," I said gently. "You loved me when you could have made my life so much worse." "But I let her hurt you," my mother insisted. "I heard the comments, saw the exclusion, and I didn't stop it hard enough." We sat together for a long time, holding hands, letting years of complicated emotion flow between us. Finally, she pulled an envelope from her purse. "This came for you," she said. "At my house. It's from your grandmother." I stared at the envelope, recognizing the shaky handwriting immediately. The letter sat unopened on my coffee table for 2 days. I walked past it dozens of times, unable to bring myself to read whatever words my grandmother had chosen. Finally, late one night, I opened it. The handwriting was shakier than usual, probably written from her hospital bed. The message was short, just 3 sentences. "You may not be my blood, but you have a strength none of us do. I was wrong about you, about everything." That was it. No explanation of why she'd been so cruel. No real apology for the specific hurts she'd inflicted, just an acknowledgement that she'd been wrong. I folded the letter carefully, tears falling onto the paper and smudging the ink. "It's too late," I whispered to my empty apartment. "Too late to fix my childhood. Too late to give me back the years I'd spent feeling worthless. Too late to erase the wounds that had shaped who I became." Julian found the letter the next morning when he came by with coffee. He read it silently, then looked at me with sad understanding. "What will you do?" he asked. I shrugged. Nothing, there's nothing to do. She said her piece. Now I can move forward. But moving forward felt harder than I expected. Months passed. I threw myself back into work, taking on extra surgeries, mentoring younger doctors, filling my days with purpose that had nothing to do with my family. Then one ordinary Tuesday, I got another call. My grandmother's condition was worsening. The transplant had bought her time, but her body was giving up in other ways. My aunt called this time, her voice gentle, no longer desperate or demanding. "She's asking for you," she said quietly. "But I understand if you don't want to come." I didn't visit, couldn't bring myself to sit at her bedside and pretend everything was resolved because of one short letter, but I did send something. A painting I'd commissioned from a local artist. A tree with deep roots wrapping around a heart, branches reaching toward the sky. I signed it simply, "Your granddaughter." The nurse called me the next day. "She kept it by her bed," she said softly. "She looked at it every morning when she woke up." That image stayed with me. My grandmother, alone in her hospital room, looking at that painting. Maybe understanding, finally, what family really meant. Maybe not. I'd never know for sure. And I was learning to be okay with that uncertainty. The call came 3 months later. My grandmother had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. I stood in my closet for an hour trying to decide if I'd go. In the end, Julian convinced me. "You'll regret not going," he said. "Not for her, but for yourself." The church was packed when I arrived. Apparently, my grandmother had been well loved by people who never saw her cruelty. The pastor stood at the podium, reading from a prepared eulogy. "Eleanor wanted me to read something she wrote herself," he said, putting on his reading glasses. The room quieted, everyone leaning forward to hear. "Family is not who shares your blood," he read in my grandmother's words. "It's who keeps your heart beating when you can't." The room went absolutely silent. Every eye in the church turned toward me. My aunt started crying. My cousins looked at their hands, shame coloring their faces. My adoptive mother reached over and squeezed my hand. The pastor continued with standard funeral words, but I barely heard them. Those 2 sentences echoed in my mind, louder than anything else. My grandmother's final public statement. An admission, a confession, maybe even an apology. I left immediately after the service, not staying for the reception. I'd heard what I needed to hear. After the funeral, my aunt approached me in the parking lot. Other mourners streamed past, heading to their cars or gathering in small groups to share memories. "Marina, wait," she called, hurrying to catch up. "There's something else." She pulled a small velvet box from her purse, pressing it into my hands. "She left this for you specifically, in her will." I opened the box slowly. Inside was a pendant, delicate and clearly old, gold with a small photo frame that opened like a locket. "That belonged to your grandmother," my aunt explained. "It was passed down from her mother. She always said she'd give it to family." I opened the locket, expecting it to be empty or to hold a photo of one of my cousins. Instead, I found a picture I'd never seen before. A much younger Eleanor, maybe 40 years old, holding a baby, holding me. I stared at the photo, my throat tightening. "When was this taken?" I asked. "The day your parents brought you home from the hospital," my aunt said quietly. "She was there. I'd forgotten until I found that locket." In the photo, my grandmother was smiling, really smiling with warmth in her eyes, before something hardened inside her, before she decided I wasn't enough. Years later, I continue my work as a transplant surgeon, but I've also started a program specifically for adopted children interested in medicine, offering mentorship, scholarships, and support. Every time I meet with these kids, I see parts of myself reflected back. The uncertainty, the need to prove themselves, the fear that they'll never really belong. "Family isn't about blood," I tell them during our meetings. "It's about who shows up for you, who believes in you, who keeps your heart beating when you can't." I keep my grandmother's locket in my office desk, taking it out sometimes when I need to remember. Not the cruel woman who rejected me, but the one who held me as a baby with genuine joy in her eyes. Both versions existed. Both were real. Julian asks me occasionally if I've forgiven her. I'm still not sure how to answer that question. Forgiveness is complicated when the wounds run so deep, but I've made peace with it, with her, with myself. "I used to think family was who you came from," I narrate softly in the videos I make for my mentorship program. "Now I know it's who you choose to heal, even when they broke you." The final line always gets the most comments. "In the end, her blood ran through my veins, but my love saved us both." It's true in ways I'm still discovering.